I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Johannes Langer and I'm the Program Manager of the Program for Social Inclusion of People Seeking Refuge in Europe at the International Dialogue Center KAICIID. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and if you can kindly mute your microphone, that would be very much appreciated. If you have any questions, please use the chat at the right of your window in front of you. There you have the chance to communicate and ask questions. Please note that this webinar is recorded. In the next hour or so, we have the great opportunity to get an input from Professor Mohammed Abonimer on the issue of social inclusion of migrants and refugees in Europe, specifically of how to use dialogue to allow for the social inclusion of migrants and refugees in Europe. It is organized by the International Dialogue Center KAICIID and the Network for Dialogue. The Network for Dialogue was initiated by the International Dialogue Center KAICIID in 2018 to bring together local faith and also secular dialogue actors from a range of European countries to empower interreligious and intercultural action for people seeking refuge and migrant inclusion. This initiative seeks to build the field of dialogue within the specific area of people seeking refuge support, while also creating a mechanism for exchange between grassroots dialogue actors, scholars, as well as policymakers. So far, the Network for Dialogue has 22 members from 9 European countries and represents a platform for developing more effective recommendations for integration and social inclusion policies for migrants and people seeking refuge in Europe. Today's webinar is also about the situation of migrants and refugees in Europe. As you all know, hundreds of thousands of people have been seeking refuge in Europe in the last years. Very often, services have been provided for refugees, but often they were not asked how they can fit in the new society that they are surrounded with. With the use of dialogue in the context of social inclusion of migrants and refugees in Europe, new opportunities can arise. This webinar aims to clarify what is dialogue in the first place, how it can be used in your work, and how dialogical approaches can be improved in your daily work. Therefore, this online webinar aims to provide new ideas on what dialogue can contribute to the field of social inclusion and how it can be incorporated in the work with migrants and refugees in Europe. In order to do all of that, we have Professor Mohammed Abonimer with us. He's the Senior Advisor to the International Dialogue Center, KAICIID, and is a professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C., where he is also joining us from today. At the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program, he served as director of the Peace Building and Development Institute and conducted interreligious conflict resolution training and interfaith dialogue workshops in conflict areas around the world, from Palestine to Iraq and the Philippines to Sri Lanka. In addition to his numerous articles and books, Dr. Abonimer is the co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Peace Building and Development, and the latest book he edited together with Michelle Jarrett is Making Peace with Faith, the Challenges of Religion and Peace Building, that came out last year. Professor Mohammed Abonimer, we're really happy that you are joining us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation that is going to last some 20 minutes or so, and afterwards there is going to be the chance for all of you to ask questions to Professor Abonimer as well. Professor Abonimer, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Johannes. Good morning to everybody. I hope I am on and you can hear me as well. I take it that the organizer will let me know if the voice is okay. Thank you for hosting me again and for joining us for the discussion of this important topic. I'll go straight into it because I think Johannes made a good introduction for the context of the refugees and immigrants in this context. So what we're trying to do is to look at the role of dialogue in contributing to social inclusion and social cohesion in societies, in particular European context where migrant and refugees are being addressed. So let me go to the, and also I hope you can see the slides as well. Let me go to the first slide where I articulate the obstacle that facing that facing that facing the work, the obstacle that facing not only the work but also the inclusion of refugees and migrants. There is a general lack of understanding of refugees in this context in general, not only cultural but also religious identity, anything that relate to their identity as well. Host community, some of them, this is obviously not for all, deal with um, deal with issues of superiority versus inferiority because of the privilege that associated with. There is definitely competition over scarce resources, limited resources as well, even in the Northern Hemisphere. A sense of historical animosity also exists in the region, in European context, due to culture and religion. This Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, and even South Asia migration route to Europe is historical, and hence there is a historical line to this relationship. There are definitely policies of exclusion and laws that provide advantage to non-refugees or first-generation immigrants. Not only, I mean, at least the least related to religion has to do with a dress code or head cover for Muslim women, building religious sites as well. Um, and also, refugees and migrants seek the protection in residential community enclave, and this is more related, in particular, first generation refugees and the immigrant tend to live together and seek the support of each other, and that create a reality of seclusion, self-seclusion in some places, but definitely enclave, ethnic and religious enclave, which basically prevent dialogue, prevent healthy contact with the host community. So if you look at the next slide, we're looking at why dialogue. Why dialogue is helpful in this second um, slide. You could see that dialogue is actually a way. It's a process that looking at dispelling and dealing with misperception, ignorance, and also develop deeper understanding. Because the issue is here really understanding a strange entity, strange person who's coming to live among us, and therefore we don't know this person, and fear and in many ways ignorance of the other side take over the communication pattern. Many of the refugees arrive with and immigrant with very little resources, and also coming from a conflict area, there is an issue of the need to humanize them. Dialogue is a great tool for humanizing the other because you discover that they are like you, there are lots of similarities, and therefore the local host community can feel, understand, as well as humanize the other person, especially if they're coming from a conflict area. It is safe enough to allow the refugees and migrants to express their sense of alienation and the pride in their culture. Many times in the dialogue, in the interaction between refugees and the immigrant community, the immigrant and refugees feel helpless, feel less powerful, less empowered, and therefore sharing the information, speaking about the concern is usually less because of the lack of safety of the environment. And hence it is difficult to find that space. Dialogue provides us with that space, with the safety aspect. Then refugees feel empowered enough and immigrants to share their culture and religious heritage and not feel ashamed of them and forced to hide their cultural and religious tradition. It builds confidence in the refugees to seek their own rights and their own as well responsibilities, but rights in particular, and build their confidence because refugee always feel that they are in kind of a position where it's how probably the best way to describe that you're always grateful if you get anything, and therefore you have difficulty asking in some ways and need to be encouraged, need to be empowered to do that. Also, there is an element of healing in the process of humiliation and loss of dignity. A refugee or an immigrant who walked 1,000 miles or 200 miles and ran through many humiliating situation in the process or as a result of war, the dialogue with the host community or with others or intra dialogue conversation can contribute to healing if it's conducted in that way. Also, it helps to shift the perception from victim to resilience, as you see in the next slide as well. When we look at how do we conduct the dialogue, what are the basic principles, and here are some 8 or 9 principles for the dialogue that I'm suggesting to guide our work. Safety of a space is probably number 1 principle because of the vulnerability both for the host community members as well as for the individual. And safety will allow people to speak their mind and pursue issues that also sensitive in that relationship. I mean, we need to think about it as a relationship situation. If you have an Afghani refugee arriving to Bonn or to Berlin after a long journey, the safety is crucial, not only for the Afghani refugee, but also for the local German community who never seen a refugee Afghani or Afghani man or Afghani woman, and they need to understand and feel safe in that conversation as well as in that space. And safety here, and we're not talking about physical. Primarily, we're talking about safety in terms of both psychological and mental, in the sense of allowing psychological and allowing people to speak about what is concerning them, what is motivating their fear and concerns. The learning is another principle. It's crucial because dialogue, in many ways, a tool for learning about the other. In many ways, even learning more about oneself. Really, we use the other in many ways in this dialogue to learn about ourselves. So we learn about our biases. So a local host community will learn more about their own ways of dealing with diversity, with own dealing with the differences, and answer the question: are we ready as a community to deal with people who are different from us, who are in need? And that's a learning process, regardless if there is an action or not. But the learning will allow people in the dialogue to be less tense and more open-minded. It can address emotional barriers and assumptions. And the emotional barriers and the assumption are the 2 major blocks for why people need dialogue. Assumptions is that what we think of Hindus or Buddhists in a European context when we see a refugee who's a Hindu from India or from, again, Pakistan or Indonesia, or a Muslim for that matter, or a Christian from Africa. There are certain assumptions in the mind of people, and those need to be re-examined. To take a risk, number 4, is basically the conversation in the dialogue cannot advance without taking a risk. Taking a risk meaning to speak about things that are sensitive, that otherwise you will not mention them, any passing conversation, but to take the risk to learn and to be vulnerable in the conversation, asking refugees and immigrants about their own issues that they have, although it might affect your own perception. If you're a French if you're a French person sitting in your own neighborhood and you see many of the refugees and the immigrants from North Africa in your streets, you probably have developed many of your stereotypes and misperception. And some of them might be have a factual base, but regardless, to take a risk is to ask about that aspect, is to cease to be ignorant about the other side, about refugees and immigrants in your town, in your city. To move slowly in the process rather than jumping, meaning to prepare for cultural, religious understanding, to form personal relationships between the people who are dialoguing. To form that personal relationship, it allows people to build them and have them to speak about other issues as well. To delve into the real and underlying issue, there are many root causes for why refugees and immigrants have arrived to that city. And without talking about those real issues, not only the history, but employment, resources, loss of dignity, those all need to be addressed in the conversation. Otherwise, we are not being honest and sincere about the conversation. And therefore, it is crucial that the dialogue relates to this hidden issue and not be afraid from raising them. I'll move faster because we talked about building relationship is essential. After all, it's not about solving the problem of one refugee or one immigrant community. It's about having a community relationship. Think about that there is a tension in the community because refugees are coming, we don't know them, and the relationship is tense, animosity, misperception, stereotypes. And we're trying to build a new perception here. An accurate one is more based on the real relationship. To be open for a change and bringing the change to other is basically to avoid having dialogue as a way to avoid taking action and only feel good about ourselves, which is a critique about the dialogue in general. If you look at the steps, what should we do in terms of steps for dialogue? And here I suggest 6 steps, but there could be 4, there could be 15, depending on how you frame it. But it's basically to get to know each other individually, and here is the humanizing part. Here you do games with the refugee, with the immigrant community, children and your children. You taste their food, they taste your food, you look at their music, they look at your music. You discover in the second phase to know their culture and value and practices, and you're not afraid from the beard of the Afghani or the turban of the Sikh or the dress of the Muslim woman or the breads of different hairstyle of any immigrant community. But these are very basic, and I know I'm treading here on some own stereotypes, but in general, stereotypes are broken in stage 2. So you understand that not every African is, or not every Muslim is, and not every South Asian Indonesian is. You as a host community from a European context, you realize that you've had as well some stereotypes. And the same also accurate for the refugees and immigrant in dialogue. They realize that not all the French are, and not all the German are, and not all the Austrian are. Those stereotypes are broken. Then you ask the question, what would be the common concern and problem that we have together as refugees and immigrants? And there are common concern for both of them because they live in the same town, the same village, the same city. Discovering those common problems is very important. whether it is health, whether it is a pressure on resources, water, whether it is noise, style of living or a style of life. Those common problems can really vary depending on the host community and other. And you also discover in number 4 that there are differences you cannot bridge. There are also power relation and privileges associated with the status of refugees and the status of a host community. You discover, for example, that the maybe most typical one is that the women's status, which is usually concern for the local host community, versus the women's status for the immigrant from, let's say, South Asia or Middle East or Africa, that the status is not as they perceived it or they want it to be. And there is discussion about that, and that cannot be changed immediately, and that there are different value system behind it. The attitude toward religion is mostly also different. And many of the immigrant community come with a strong faith. In fact, faith have helped them to be resilient in the process of the journey of becoming refugees and immigrants. And you come, and the host community in majority is secular, and they don't necessarily practice their faith even the same way that other practice in the in African or South Asian context or Middle Eastern context, and those cannot be changed easily. Anyway, you discover there are things that you have to accept. They are different than you, and we are different than them, and the us and them get to know each other. And there are then number 5, you explore what is it that prevent the social cohesion in the community, and that's really the most important question, to look at the structural and institutional barrier in the relationship. And finally, in the process of dialogue that can take 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, 15, 2 years, 10 years, you get to ask the question, what can we do together to address the common problem? And that's in many ways where dialogue need to go to number 6 to be able to look at those. I'll close with the, because I think I'm very close to the about 2 minutes more. There are a number of limitations for the encounter between refugees and immigrant program. And if you look at the internet right now and you do scan, just Google dialogue and refugees, dialogue and immigrant, and you see that some of the programs are really being used by government, local and national government, for polishing the image, for election, for political manipulation, or doing it in a symbolic way, not really sincere. And I wouldn't even call those dialogue. These are some form of encounters or exposure program that are one-sided, where we use very little resources and bring refugees and do the photo up, do the images, and you move on. There is no real commitment for it. Second limitation, predetermined ceiling for change, stereotypes reduction, cultural exposure, language teaching. And this is a ceiling that we put for the dialogue or encounter with refugee program. We say this is only learning, this is not political. We want to reduce stereotypes and understand their culture. And I think it's important not to minimize that, but the ceiling is already determined. And in many ways, the ceiling determined in order to serve the immigrant community, not to serve the local host community and power, rather than the immigrant community, or at least the power relation is asymmetric there. Meaning we bring the immigrant and the refugees to the meeting of the program, but we're not really interested or able or insisting on addressing the structural problems in the society or in the community. For example, when they ask to change the board of a company, the board of the organization, we say, no, this is not part of the encounter. The encounter is educational or cultural. Many of the encounters are short term, which prevent sustainability. So if you only do one or two meetings, then that really reduces the effect. They could also, this program can serve the community to feel better and morally, not sorry, orally, morally superior. There is a mistake here. Morally superior to the refugees. And here, because the way the program is conducted, it's conducted in a way that I bring the refugees to the parliament or to the local mayor office or to the local authority, or bring them and put them in front of the TV and show how we as local host community helping them without necessarily their voice. And there is an element of objectification of the refugee and the immigrant, and many people complain about that. One more, the genuine, to reform the structure that deals with immigrant and refugee diverse issue, that's a problematic. I see this many times in countries in North Africa as well as South Asia, where you have some refugees in that country, and then from South Africa or from Central Africa, or from the Rohingya in Malaysia and Indonesia and other countries, or internal refugees in many places, where there are structural and there are rules that prohibit their integration. Immigrant cannot own, immigrant cannot have access to certain resources, to certain structures, even residentially. And there are rules, there are laws that regulate this. Dialogue encounter program should be able to address that needs and not make it as a taboo. Finally, the measures of success in dialogue. Some people ask, okay, how do we know that this is successful or not? I will share with you 6, but these are not obviously comprehensive. And if, there are many other you can add. But the first one, as I said, a good, successful dialogue program where people learn new information and deeper their understanding of what are the challenges that face immigrant and refugees and the host community itself, not only one side. Second, it builds sustainable relationship with the refugees and the immigrant. It goes beyond the meeting. There are personal relationships that are formed. There are group relationships that are formed as well. 3, there is an institutional commitment to address the need of immigrants and refugees. The institutional commitment comes from as a result of the dialogue organization. If the mayor office is initiating that, if the government, if a faith-based organization, the church, initiating the program, there is a commitment from that institute to continue, and the refugee and immigrant will feel included as well as comfortable in that relationship. Immigrant community, they feel their capacity to pursue their right has enhanced, has been built. So you don't develop dependency as a result of the dialogue. You cut the dependency. Refugees and immigrants become more independent in pursuing their rights. Increase the skills for problem solving issues facing communities and individuals. Both host community and immigrant community and refugee, they face problems in dealing with each other. And the problem solving that can emerge together as a result of the dialogue is an important learning, is an important outcome, because you want to develop internal mechanism to solve a problem. And here we're talking about, even kids fought in the school, or somebody has trouble accessing certain resource, then there are mechanisms for developing these problem solving techniques. Finally, increase awareness of the implication for integration versus enclave. Refugees always debate, and immigrants always debate, should we be integrated or should we live in seclusion, residentially alone, have our own food, our own culture, our own practices of marriage and and gender relations, religious practices, and a dialogue conversation between the host community and the refugee and the immigrant should be able to sharpen the awareness on the implication of what does it mean to be a Muslim immigrant in European context in Sweden who actually decide to integrate in the Swedish society. How does it look like? How does it look like for an Afghani refugee in Austria, Vienna, to be integrated in the Viennese community? And that element of integration is a problematic for both of them and need to be looked upon. The same huge issue exists for Turkish minority immigrants and refugees in many of the European countries, and that issue has to be clarified as well. I will stop here. There are many other things that one can mention here, but the last two screens that you have are really example of creative European reaction to refugees, with some music and dialogue, and there are some videos you can watch them, and you can see UNHCR model on dialogue on human rights that they work with refugees as well. Thank you, and apology if I took about 25 minutes or 22 minutes. Thank you. Back to you, Johannes and Alexandra.
Hey, Professor, thank you so much for your interesting intervention and your presentation. That is really very much appreciated. We are now coming to the second part of our webinar, which is going to be the questions and answer session. And I would kindly to invite all of you to type the questions that you have to the professor. They can also be comments and are going to be read out aloud. Just to make like a small recap in the meantime, what we heard. First of all, we started what kind of difficulties migrants and refugees are facing in the process of social inclusion when they arrive in a new country. Professor Abonimer afterwards talked about why we can use dialogue, how it can help to build a relationship situation, what is dialogue, and how principles and strategies work. He afterwards addressed the 6 different steps of a dialogue process that we can follow, but he also pointed out that several limitations go along whenever dialogue is used in refugees and immigrants programs. And finally, one of the big questions that we always have as well, how do we know that we are successful when we are using dialogue in the work with refugees and migrants as well? And now I really want to hand over to you, and would like to ask you if there are any kind of questions on your end that I am of course happy to read out for you as well. And I allow the freedom to actually start with a question myself, and that is going along Professor Abonimer about when you talk about the assumptions that are so key that we all need to deal with and all the misperceptions. You also talked about the risks that one can take in a dialogue process, but also that one shouldn't be afraid to raise the difficult questions. Yet, what I often experience is that there is like a certain fear, in particular when it comes to raise the difficult questions. And it is very easy as well that people get offended in such kind of process when difficult questions are raised. What is your experience with that to deal with such kind of situations?
Thank you, Johannes, for starting us with the question. And that's really an important one. I want to make sure that we also have a distinction between conflict area dialogue and also violent and conflict area conflict versus a dialogue in a less tense and less violent context. And the level of difficulty of the question, I think, ranges and affected by the historical relationship among the people who are dialoguing. So it's hard to establish one reaction or measure for this. But in general, one can say that it's the job of the facilitator and the convener to make sure that the delving on the difficult questions and sensitive one is gradual, meaning that if you have a British and an Indian a dialogue group, or Pakistani and the British who are talking about their historical relationship, it's very important in the initial 2 hours not to talk about colonialism, and not to speak about the history of the relationship and the tension, but to take the first 2 hours, 3 hours, and one day to get to know each other, and gradually you delve into the question. The more you build commonalities in the front, the easier become to raise difficult and sensitive question. Obviously, trust need to be built in the group, and that's one of the main duties of the facilitators. These are just initial reaction, Johannes. I hope this is along the line of what you ask for. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Sorry, I was still unmuted, but there's another question of Amanda Figueras from Foro Abraham, based in Madrid. And her question is how to manage your feelings when you see the other is biased towards yourself. Is there any strategy that is out there and that you could recommend for her?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question from Madrid. Um, um, that's also a good question, because that's really typical dynamic in any dialogue. The dialogue is an exchange of biases. I could describe it as a healthy exchange of biases, meaning that you yourself have biases. Everyone around the table, everyone who's sitting in that circle of 20, 30 people in the room, everyone has biases. And when somebody speak about their own bias, or you detect biases against your group, dialogue tells us that you need to, first of all, suspend the judgment. The suspension of the judgment is a technique we teach in dialogue training to allow the person to question their reaction to the bias. For example, if you're let's take something from your context. You're a Spanish and you have a relationship with Morocco, historical one, and you are in a dialogue with the Moroccan group in Madrid or in Cordoba. And there is a bias. A Moroccan participant said something about his own stereotype of how Spanish pursue Muslim or Moroccan, and you disagree with that. So you have several options. You either can interrupt him or her, you can scream, you can insult them, you can defensively react to them and try to prove that their point is wrong, which might be wrong, but nevertheless, your reaction, the more it is defensive, the less likelihood that the person from Morocco who's felt comfortable enough with you to share their stereotypes, they will become more defensive, and they will probably, to defend themselves, they will go to exaggeration, and they might become even more emotional. So then your defensiveness is feeding into their defensive as well. In dialogue, the job of the facilitator is to calm both of you down and ask you, the one who reacting to their bias, why is it that you defensively reacting? And then you have a chance to explore inside your own self reaction, as well as you can articulate the facts. That's a very common response that we facilitator of dialogue take when we see that somebody is reacting to a bias. But obviously, this requires ground rules of listening, ground rules of healthy conversation. I hope I responded to you. Maybe we can also expand on it if no other questions. Johannes, back to you.
Thank you so much, Professor. There is another question that came in from Grace from WOSM Africa Support Center, and she's saying, I recently heard of a refugee community who were not allowed to be registered, and this meant that they were not able to access crucial government services, which required one to be registered, to be a registered citizen. What steps would you recommend as we try to integrate this community?
Oh, thank you for the question, and it's a question more about advocacy and solving problems, institutional or structural problem that prevent refugees and immigrants from accessing resources, and obviously it relates to a government policy in terms of how they want to integrate or not integrate refugees and immigrants. But this could be a theme for conversation, for a dialogue between a government official and between refugees and immigrant representative convened by your organization. You can get the policy. You don't have to go through high-level policy people. You can go with the working level and be able to ask the question, why is it this policy helpful or not helpful? And for refugees and immigrant community that you work with also to understand and convey their part. This is if you want to do it in a dialogical way. If you want to go through the advocacy, whatever you do, it should be peaceful and non-violent in many ways. But there are many ways to do advocacy for a cause. All of them indicate that this should be done not only by you as an organization, but it should be done in cooperation and a close coordination with the representative of the refugee and immigrant community, who should be in the forefront of this campaign and be consulted and included in that process as well. So it's will be done from within their own needs and not only from the host organization who's sympathetic or have a solidarity. So the two paths, you can dialogue with the policymakers on a working level, in a school, and in areas where you want to clarify the issue. And you can do advocacy, nonviolent advocacy, where you create a campaign in order to influence a pressure on the government, local government, to change the policy. And that influence, exercise the pressure and influence, again, can be done through education and also through media, through meetings, through churches, through the religious institution. Anyone who can be an ally for you can be mobilized in that direction. But again, my principle here, any of that work should really be rooted within the refugee and immigrant community, with their voices, with their needs, and not only with the host community. Back to you, Johannes.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have another question coming in from Rabbi Jeff, and he is pointing out and asking, dialogue is an enormously useful tool, but how do we address the issue of mass immigration, of often innocent people being forced out of their own country due to a local conflict and seeking refuge in an area of higher economic standard, drastically different climate and cultural pattern? With millions of people being displaced, how should a country decide a policy for receiving or refusing to help? Is this also part of dialogue? Rabbi Jeff is asking.
Wow. Thank you, Rabbi Jeff. Those are three difficult questions. One is the push, has to do with the push factor. The push factor, the reasons that push people to leave their countries and their home. And one should say, obviously, no one ever backs and leave because they want to leave their home. There are factors that push them out. If it's a violence like in the Syrian civil war, I mean, obviously the answer to many of these is policy and intervention of international community to prevent the escalation of wars, to protect civilian, to reduce the effect of the war in many of the in this situation. But again, Sri Lanka or Philippines or Chad and DRC or Central African Republic, these are all civil wars that no one really intervene in them internationally in a way serious, systematic to prevent it. And we only, in general, deal with consequences of these wars. Unfortunately, politicians, and in many ways, I'm going to speak here in a more macro way, we humans still struggling in finding international institutions that prevent wars and violence in a massive way, but also we're still struggling not only to prevent the war, we're still struggling in effective ways to intervene. The state system that is manifested in the UN membership has not yet managed to produce mechanisms that are effective and allow them to prevent mass migration, prevent civil war, unfortunately. So for now, we should treat it as a part of our reality. There will be refugees, there will be immigrants as a result of the violence in these countries. Then the second question is, how do you get the British and the German and the Northern Hemisphere or Japan or America, Canada and United States to receive immigrants and refugees from the neighboring countries or outside? And I think it's not only morally, it's not only human responsibility to each other, but also a matter of resources. That's very important. And you don't want people to die on your borders because they are starving or because they are threatened. I think morally we have to deal with that, and there is a obligation, a human obligation to each other to help people today, because you tomorrow might also need help from your own powerful position of today. The policies that in place, unfortunately, not always welcoming. Whether it is in European context or American context, but there are certain variation, and I think the example of maybe Sweden, the example of Norway, the example of Germany, example of Canada. These are countries that I think invested more carefully in treating the immigrants and the refugees in a more humane, more inclusive, I should say, with more dignity. I think protecting a human dignity in the process is a crucial factor that we should keep in mind. So these experiences, you can look them up and you compare them to policies in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, when refugees pass through certain countries. Those are very, very vast differently. Not only resources, but I think also political attitude and cultural attitude toward refugees. And that makes a big difference in the relationship once the refugee and the immigrant are settled as well. I'm not sure that I have the magic solution, Jeff, for this, but what I am saying is that today, if we have resources, abundant of resources in the north, where African refugees would like to get as immigrant and as refugee, and they're risking their life in the shores of Libya and the shores of Italy. They're doing this in many ways as a result of a long historical injustices that we in the North, in Europe and America, had a say and had an influence on it. So not only historical responsibility, but also moral and human responsibility to help each other in this context. Some argue, the resources are not enough. I come from the school that says, the resources are expanded or shrank based on our own preference and priorities. And I think those resources, there is abundance of resources on this planet. The way we have currently managed these resources is the wrong way. And the problem is not in the number of resources. The problem is in the way that we handle the climate, we handle the environment, the way our cultures have grown to value certain issues for consumptions and excessive waste. But again, I don't want to be preaching in this direction. The principle, we have the moral and the human obligation to help refugees, regarding because of they are pushed or because they are pulled by economic incentive. We have to help, and it's our moral responsibility. In the mid 40s, African countries were helping European refugees of the Second World War as well as the First World War. So it's only been about 60 or 70 years old, or even 80 years old since those two wars took place. So in many ways, history repeats itself. Thank you. I hope I gave you some direction in that reaction. But thank you, Jeff, for your question.
Thank you so much for your elaborate answer, Professor Abu Nimer. There are two more questions that are there at the moment. One is from Alexandra Duric-Milovanovic, the Network for Dialogue coordinator. And she's asking, what are potential ways to promote dialogue in policymaking in the field of social inclusion of refugees and migrants in Europe? And along with that, how do grassroots civil society organizations can contribute towards that? That would be one question from Alexandra. And there is another question from Chaya. And Chaya is asking, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Regarding the limitations of dialogues discussed, I'm wondering if local religious and other minority communities face similar challenges to refugee communities, and if there is a role they can play in facilitating meaningful dialogue that leads to commitment past token photo opportunities.
The local minority. Sorry, Johannes. The question about local minorities. She said, Shaya.
Yes, Chaya is wondering. Yes. I'm wondering if local religious and other minority communities.
Thank you. Yes, I got it.
Face similar challenges to refugee communities, and if there is a role they can play. Yeah.
Thank you. So briefly to Alexandra, I think that's a great question, and really, Alexandra, as you know by now, that in the last 10 years at least, a great deal of development has taken place in a European policy makers level, where there is more awareness for the need to deal with religion, with culture, with diversity. And I think dialogue is being introduced not only by KAICIID, but also by other organizations. But primarily our work has been with the European Union, with the OSCE, with ODIHR, with other European entities as well, with the Parliament, and with UNESCO and other intergovernmental organizations, where we try to bring the notion that for local policy and for national policy level, that it's essential to get to know and interact with the refugees and immigrants and with minorities in the European context. And there is a room, and I think there is a need for this. Not only need and room, but fortunately, there is some doors that are being open in the policymaker. The issue is really how organized the faith-based community and the grassroots community to capitalize on this opening. And here is the second part of your question. I think grassroots movements and the grassroots encounters and the grassroots organizations are very important and crucial for this. The Hindu, the Buddhist, the Muslim, and the Christian different, and the Jewish different local faith-based organization in European context have to take the refugee and the immigrant as a cause for them, like they're trying to take the climate or the gender equality or the AIDS or the health or protection of animal fighting against animal cruelty, whatever the cause that they have taken as a church. Immigrant and refugee should become also a cause for them, dealing with diversity. And the second point, we realized through the work of KAICIID that the advocacy and dialogue of one organization, one group, one religious group is not as effective and cannot really be effective. To be effective, you have to bring the Muslim and the Jews in Europe, the Hindus and the Buddhists, and the Muslim and the Jews and the Christian all together and support coalition building. So a platform that combine two or more organizations is a way to move forward to establish a more effective advocacy campaigns or advocacy part. But again, that cannot take place out of nowhere. It has to be done on the base of a dialogical relationship. You have to learn about the cause of the African refugees in Germany or in France in order for you to join their campaign. And that can happen through the dialogue, through the encounter. So the encounter with the refugees and the immigrant on the grassroots is the crucial. So we can talk about macro level policy. How do we change the policies of the EU or the policies of the French government? But that is a conversation not for every organization, and many of the organizations are not aware of this. And also it needs really more grassroots linkages, and those happen through day-to-day interaction. The Friday, the Saturday, the Sunday religious rituals of the community coming together is the key for helping with these campaigns, with the pressure from the grassroots community. Alexandra, just because of time, I'm gonna stop here so I can respond to the other question from Gia regarding the minority. You're absolutely right. The same principle applies. In fact, refugees and immigrants are minority groups. They're not only ethnic or religious, they are minority by their legal status. And basically, a minority is a group that have problem accessing resources. And that's the refugees and the community as well. So the same principle can apply to the minority in many places where the encounter between the minority and the majority is used for photo op or photo or propaganda. The way to go about this, I've had experience in a number of places where refugee community either refused to participate or they had conditions. Say, yes, I will show up for your photo opportunity, but in exchange, I need to speak. I need to have my voice heard in your platform. Or in exchange, I'd like to have some suggestion for your board, for the organization itself. But that's the type of thing. I think rejection to participate from the beginning is a costly one, because if you reject to participate from the first time an organization reach out to you, then you are not giving a chance for building the relationship. Again, but you participate in one time in the condition to continue the relationship. I found those to be more helpful engagement to get out of the photo op frame. Also, organization in many ways do the photo op or do the propaganda or polishing image in many ways because they don't know. They don't have the resources, and they need help of the minority members who participate to become more aware of why they need to go beyond the initial humanizing activity or ritualistic activity. So minority as well have responsibility to engage and try to break that pattern of interaction. Johannes, back to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Abonimer. It is really appreciated. And with those words of yours, we are basically already coming to an end as well, as the webinar has lasted its hour already. I think it was a very rich discussion that we had. Thank you so much for your input. Thank you so much for all the questions that we have received. What I have taken away from today's webinar is that the use of dialogue is very powerful with refugees and with migrants. It provides the opportunity to build relationship. One can also build more resilience specifically for refugees and migrants as well, and ultimately can allow to have a better understanding of each other as well, as long as we are in the position and have the willingness to take the necessary risk as well. Another important point that you have pointed out towards the end is, of course, the coalition building as well for advocacy, so the dialogue can be used more actively in policymaking, but also by civil society itself as well. And I think that is something that the Network for Dialogue is promoting very strongly, and KAICIID is, of course, very much backing as well. At the very end, I would like to note to everyone that this webinar was recorded and will be put online on the YouTube channel of the International Dialogue Center KAICIID. I also want to point out to you in general that the Network for Dialogue will present a booklet in about a month's time with 11 promising practices from around Europe that have been contributed from Network for Dialogue members. If you're interested in the Network for Dialogue, please write to us. You can see our email address in the chat. Many thanks for joining us and for the fruitful discussions. I really appreciate that you took the time to be part of this important conversation. Particularly many thanks, of course, to Professor Mohammed Abonimer for his wise input and for getting up so early this morning. He joined us at 7 a.m. His time. So thank you so much, Professor Abonimer. And I also want to thank, of course, my colleagues here at the International Dialogue Center KAICIID, particularly Angela Dora, Anya, and Gopal, who have made this webinar possible today. I wish you a wonderful day and hope that we are going to be in touch very soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.